Okay, well, welcome everyone in these very different circumstances. I never thought I'd ever see this. I've been giving talks for about over 40 years about King's Lynn, and this is the first time in such a setting. But thank you for supporting the museum. I always kick off the series, and believe it or not, this is our 20th series of three. And we have I think you know the programme, I shan't go through it, but we always have 8 talks. And because 1 or 2 speakers couldn't come for health reasons, I'm also doing the last one on the history of King's Lynn Minster. But in February, when we start again, and my first talk will be the plague in King's Lynn in the 17th century. You'd be amazed about how similar they handled or managed the plague in the 17th century to today, but completely by accident. They had no scientific advice, it was just sort of hit and miss, and they were lucky. They wore masks, for example, and people had to stay indoors, and it's all very interesting. And this talk, if there is a fire alarm, you must go out this way into the yard. I mean, I know that's highly unlikely. And please, when I finish, I must finish by 12, because I'm on again at 1. I'll get told off. Please remain in your seats when I finish, and Rebecca will sort of ask you to go out in, I say in rows, we have got rows, although they're very sparse. Rebecca will ask you to go out, spaced, so you're not all trying to get out at the same time at the end. Well, this talk is called Lost King's Lynn, 1817-2020. There's a gigantic interest in the last few years about, I wouldn't call it nostalgia, but an awareness of loss. For example, Historic England, the English Heritage, brought out a big book a couple of years ago called Lost England. The publishers are jumping on the bandwagon in the last 2 or 3 years. Amberley Press, which are based in Stroud in Gloucester, are doing this. They picked £25 about Lost York, Lost Stratford, Lost Worcester, and they asked me to do Lost King's Lynn. So I've sent the script and all the photographs. I send that off in May, and hopefully it will be published before Christmas. It's one of a series, so you can see the great interest of books and publishers in this whole theme. And I guess this year, because of this, I call it an epidemic, that's what we called it in the past, I suppose the changes in our country, some will be permanent, some won't be, but I guess it will make people even more nostalgic about the past, I would guess. The book I've written is really in 6 chapters, which I'm not going to go through today because there's far too much of it. Clearly, change in the last 150 years has been tremendous, and of course you can show that change with photography. You can't go too far back. I was asked a question yesterday by email about finding out someone who lived in the late 18th century in King's Lynn. The further back you go, the more difficult it becomes. But photography started up in the 1850s. The first photograph in King's Lynn was 1854. A chap called Mr. Cotton travelled the country taking photographs of historic towns in the 1850s, and he came to Lynn in 1854, and we have a photograph, the earliest photograph of King's Lynn is the South Gates, or the South Gate in 1854. So really, these books got to be not just words books based on photographic images. So I had to marshal, I think it was 170 photographs, and each photograph has a caption. And it's in 6 chapters. The first one is all about the North End. I'll show a few slides on the North End, because here in this North End, that's where King's Lynn's first industrial revolution impacted most. Because here you have a fishing community centuries old, and this fishing community is in rocks and sandwiches factory by industrialisation. So in 1914 you have in the whole society, even fishing boats like the one in the yard, they had until the 1920s. They had no engines. You know, they had to be rowed out into the wash, or if the tug was available from the docks, they were put by the tug into the wash. And my second chapter is all about how Lynn's maritime society along the riverside streets was lost because of steamships and the railways taking away coastal trade. And this is reflected in all the pubs in Queen Street. I live in an old pub. I live in Queen Street, and our house was called the 3 Crowns. there were 8 pubs in Queen Street. There were 9 in 8 pubs in King Street, 8 in Queen Street, another 6 in Nelson Street. They all closed around about 1914 because of the onset of steamships, which were bigger, didn't need so many sailors. All the coastal trade sales stopped, and all these pubs relied on maritime Lynn, the old Lynn. So the old Lynn was cut across, and it's reflected in all these pubs being shut in a very short time. My third chapter is about housing. Everyone for centuries lived in the town centre to walk to work. There's no trams, there's no buses from suburbs. The workers don't live in suburbs. They live in the town on top of their jobs for centuries and centuries and centuries. And that all changes in the 20th century. And it's about Norfolk Street, a study of Norfolk Street, and all the yards. Norfolk Street had more yards than any other street in Lynn. So most people in Norfolk Street lived in yards behind the shop, behind the main streets. And about the conditions there and how the coming of democracy led to an attack, if you like, in inverted commas, on the slums, as the Tory party and the Liberal party, no Labour party till 1900, began to focus on social reform and making housing decent. And council housing didn't come until the 1930s, 1940s. Very late in this country, council housing. True's Yard is one of the last Fisherfolk yards because most people in North End lived in yards too. So that's looking at housing and how people lived in conditions. My fourth chapter about the High Street. In the High Street, well, I walked down the High Street before last year, late last year, and I counted up how many shops in the High Street were there in 1964. So I had my 1964 trade directory with me and just ticked them off. Only 4 shops remain from 1964, late last year. And because of this year, that's going to be even more radical, isn't it? They're going to go, I think, well, I hope they don't. One is Samuel the Jewellers, that was there in 1964, and that's still there. And we shall see. But the High Street reflects change in the late 19th century. Because Lynn has a first industrial revolution, there are more people with more money in their pockets. You get new shops, and the first department store is Jones, which was set up by a Norfolk lad, Alfred German, in 1947, taken over by Debenhams, and Debenhams closed it recently. Yeah. So that Lynn's first department store is now dead, closed, unfortunately. I've got a Debenhams card in my wallet because I'm King's Lynn, but I'm going to give it up now. I was in Newcastle 2 weeks ago, went into Debenhams, but even in Newcastle there's a huge Debenhams, and I did buy a couple of shirts, but there weren't many shops there, not as many as I knew, because I go to Newcastle at least once a year, and not so many. So the High Street is the most important historic street in every town in a way, because the changes in the High Street reflect the history of that town. If there's no industrial revolution, there's no development, it stays the same. If there's development and industrialisation, it changes with department stores and big stores of chain stores like Boots the Chemist of Nottingham. I spent a year at Nottingham University and doing my teacher's certificate, and there was lots of talk about Jesse. I never heard of all these people. Jesse Boot, because Nottingham Boots are a Nottingham firm, aren't they? And they opened a store in Lynn in 1909. And then moved across the street to their present store. Thank goodness they're still open in the High Street. But they abandoned a lovely shop which they had purpose-built to fit in with Lynn's historic scene. Places like, if you know Suffolk, I really like East Suffolk where my sister lives. If you know Suffolk, you can walk through Lavenham and other smaller towns. There's been no industrial revolution. There's been no development. The High Street, it looks like what it did in the 16th century. And then my fifth chapter is about fleets and rivers. I have fleets and rivers. Industry and people in Lynn, there were 4 major fleets and rivers: Fisher Fleet, Mill Fleet, the Purr Fleet, and Fry's Fleet, called the River Lynn. Everyone lived along those banks, many people did, and there were breweries and shipyards. They were the hubs of industry, and buildings hugged their banks. And until the late 19th century, all gone, all swept away. There was a whaling industry and the shipbuilding industry near the South Gates until the 1870s. That went, the whaling industry had gone slightly before that. But the fleets of breweries, I'll show you a couple of pictures in a minute, breweries on the Mill Fleet. So breweries, lots of maltings. It has still got lots of maltings left which haven't been demolished, especially in King Street, behind the main houses. They're all apartments. I'm sure you've been in some of them. They make very nice apartments, these converted maltings. Lynn is still full of maltings, but many were demolished, and many warehouses were demolished, and modern buildings. So the fleets are now have been covered over, lost. The fleets have been more or less lost, but the fleets are a big thing. And my final chapter is about King's Lynn since the 1960s, when Lynn was stagnating a bit after its first industrial revolution, led by Frederick Savage. And what's going to happen to Lynn? There's only 25,000 people, all the old Victorian industries are dying, there'll be no employment, no opportunities for young people. They didn't go to university much because not many working class people went to university in 1950. In 1930, there were only 30,000 people at university in this country. It just seems amazing now, doesn't it? There's 3 million. So Lynn was stagnant, and the solution eventually was London Overspill. So London Overspill happened. They signed the document in 1962 with a project to bring 20,000 London people to settle in Lynn and 50 or 60 new companies. The companies came. Many were smaller than they were wanted to be, but the companies came like Jaeger and so on, pencil factories. But the people, not everyone came. About 10,000 people resettled from London. Some went back. Some loved it and stayed, of course. And they built Fairstead for that Overspill. I call it Overspill. But there are many Overspill towns in the southeast of England. London lost population, like Liverpool has lost population. Liverpool now is under 500,000 people. It's not a big city anymore because so many people have moved out for the last 50 years. Manchester, so all these bigger cities have shrunk because people have moved out. Except Birmingham, which continued to grow tremendously between the wars. The city of Birmingham, which I know very well, is still 1.2 million, a big city. Places like Leicester are about 300. Norwich is a small city, about 120,000, but with the suburbs about 200,000. Leicester's 300. Newcastle's about 300,000, but in a conurbation. So it's all about Lynn, how it was changed by the second industrial revolution, which changed the town centre, big shops and car parks. We lost a lot of historic buildings and all the industrial estates on the outskirts. So Lynn's identity, Lynn still has connections with the past. You can walk down the riverside streets and feel the history of hundreds of years ago. You're connected by the buildings and the atmosphere, but the actual identity of the town and its social makeup has been transformed in the last 120 years, completely transformed, especially in the last 50 years. So this whole sense of loss and past it's very clear and sharp for many people. And so what I'm going to show you, I can't show you slides from all 6 chapters. It would take too long. As I said, I'd probably get into trouble. So I've selected 3. So I've selected the North End, pubs and fleets. So of the 6, it's called sampling. And but it would take far too long to show you all 160 odd photographs. So this is just a selection. I've got my German, I hope this works okay. I've got my German laser. And the old North End fishing Halter, of course, just to give you a taste of this. This is Dougie Carter. Look at his Gansey. Lovely, thick blue, navy blue jumper, oily, keeping out the winds in the wash. And it had to fit you very tightly. Although that doesn't look so tight, I've heard people through the oral tradition, I've heard people say, he's 60 odd here, but when young men tried their first Gansey on to go out into the wash, and they had to pull it over their head, that if their ears didn't bleed, it was no good. They're tough North Enders, you know. When I go to the O's Bows, John, and other places, I still recognise North Enders. I'm not a North Ender, I come from near the South Gate. I'm an old South Lynner, I suppose. I had relatives in the North End. And that's the Reverend Huddle. He was the curate next door at St Nicholas, and that's Joe Anderson, who lived in this street. And between them, these 2 chaps, the composer Vaughan Williams, 20 folk songs. And during this period, around about 1900, that was a big loss. We lost folk song. We lost the ballads. We lost the traditions of the English people passing on their experiences and history. Because of universal education, because of breaking up of old industries and communities, the North End was breaking up. Vaughan Williams collected these folk songs in 1905. Much later, it had been too late. He got there just in time. So not only is Vaughan Williams admired in this area, he's not only an important English composer whose whole musical life was shaped by his coming to Lynn and the folk song of the English people, It's also, he's also a social historian. Through saving those songs, he saved a lot of our history as well. So he should be admired on those two counts, as a musician and as a social historian. So a great sense of loss. I've forgotten how many exactly, but up until this time, 1900, which is not that long ago in historical terms, there were thousands of, maybe tens of thousands of people selling songs, ballad sheets, people singing in the streets. People made announcements in the streets as if it was a news broadcast. Ballad singers, they used to travel around the towns. You see them in sad things like in Kingsley newspapers, 1841. I saw one, Mary, I've forgotten her surname, Mary something. She was staying in a lodging house in Norfolk Street. She died there. And she was a ballad singer and seller of ballads. And she spent her life going around the towns selling ballads, singing in the streets, making announcements. When in 1840s, when there was a lot of religious revival, two guys inside the South Gate, they built a little stage. They were religious people. They stood on the stage and announced the second coming of Christ. And they got a crowd of about 300 around them in about half an hour. That was going on in our streets. Song passed through the history of the English people. Vaughan Williams picked up one of his favourite was on board in 98. 98 is the biggest British battleship, 98 guns. And in 1941, he told the government, he was brought into the government Department of War, and said, can you write some military music? Because the Germans and the Russians are using it. I don't know if you're aware, but in the Second World War, and when the Russians were advancing into Germany, they put up these huge pools, and on top, loudspeakers, they played Shostakovich. The Red Army, not always, but the Red Army often went into battle with the music of the great Russian composers. And the British government thought, well, why don't we do something similar? And Vaughan Williams, one of the tunes he gave was On Board in 98, which occurred in Lynn in 1905. And that's Trujar, believe it or not. The two cottages are there. That's Sam Southgate. He was the last Lynn boy who was a deep sea pilot. And because the ships from this fishing fleet went further out in the Wash today, which is lost, the fleet is actually growing, but it's very much inshore. For example, the Conservancy Board have been asked 2 more fishing smacks, new people want to have berths on the South Quay near Bank House. I don't know if you've seen the one there at the moment. The Lynn Princess was there last year. 2 more applied. The Lynn fishing fleet has actually grown, but it's not deep sea, it's inshore. And this is Van Pelt. Timo, his name was. His father came to the North End from Holland. A big Dutch influence into Lynn, as you know, in the 17th century. Then again after the First World War. Here at Trujar, in the attic on the front range, the Van Pelts, when they came over, they lived in an attic here at Trujar. And then one of them took a pub in Pilot Street, one became a pilot, and so on. So there's a big Dutch, and some of the Dutch influence you can see in this cottage. If you go and have a look, you can see the Dutch furniture and ceramics and so on. Big influence. And look at the phone book for Dutch names in Kingston. I saw a lady last week, John Brent, the professor who you introduced me to last week.
Yes.
The lady said, I didn't know, you wouldn't have guessed that she was from Holland originally.
Yeah.
You'd never have guessed it from the speech. And she said, I didn't know where I was when I came to King's Inn, whether I was in England or in Holland. And she said, it reminded me so much of a Dutch town. Well, I said, one Dutch town I like is Kampen. She said, Kampen. So Kampen is the Dutch town which King's Lynn reminds her of. So the North End has that influence. Next door here in Kingsley, you can't read that very well, that says Humphrey. That's a ship chandlers, but they also sell paint, they sell turpentine, they made rope, they even have the rope walk just on near the Eastgate area. They had a rope walk, then they had lots of rope walks. People walking, making ropes, they're all over the place, rope walks. Because Lynn was a maritime sailing town. And so Humphreys were there for a long time. There's Mr. Humphrey with his assistant, and it was tragically just next door here, where the new flats are. It was demolished in 1970. Humphreys was. Lynn had several chandlers in the past, of course. You saw that coming in, perhaps. That's Frank Carson, who was the first chairman of the trust, of the North End Trust. That's Frank mending nets. Usually women mended nets rather than men, and nets were taken to St Nicholas Chapel to be blessed in St Nicholas Chapel. And Frank used to build his own craft. He was not only a fisherman and a poet, and his book called The North End, or the North Enders, is found in the bookshop. He was not only a good writer, a poet, and a net maker, he was everything. He built boats, quite incredible. And that craftsmanship has gone, all that craftsmanship to do with boats, except for one or two people, including Paul Lake, who's probably in the yard now, putting the last touches, I hope, to our fishing smack in the yard. It's called Activity. Built in 1904, we're restoring it for the second time. It'll also be the last time, because if it's restored again, it'll be a replica. Like the Baden Pole, but don't quote me.
Oh.
Well, the Baden Pole, because I'm involved, I'm a trustee of the Baden Pole, and as you took more bad timbers out, you discovered more and more bad timbers. And once you start working on old craft, as you probably know, it doesn't stop. It's very expensive. We had to go out and raise more money just to get that done. And but Frank was a great bloke. He died in 1994. When at meetings in the late 1980s, he chaired meetings, but he depended on roll-ups. He smoked with roll-ups, and the meetings sometimes went on for about 2 or 3 hours, and it took him that amount of time to get it alight. But I got on very well with him. Frank, he was a good boy, as they say in Norfolk, good boy. Yeah. And these have gone. The river, why don't we make more use of the river? We've recently extended the pontoons, as you know. It's called Sail the Wash. We're trying to get more craft in here. And but we need onshore facilities. You won't get people coming without showers and toilets on the South Quay. And that's on the agenda for the council, but nothing's much being done about it at the moment. But the fishermen used to have races every September. It's called the King's Lynn Regatta, sometimes the Royal Regatta. And here they are on the River Ouse. This is 1908. These are fishermen, look, and all the fisherfolk. There's usually 2 or 3 families who own smacks. Most fisherfolk didn't own anything. They didn't own boats, they didn't own their houses, they paid rent. They worked for the few people who owned the fishing smacks, a minority. And so the owners used to race each other. It's a very important, taken very seriously by the North Enders. And here they all are. This is somewhere behind the Corn Exchange. And the First World War stopped it. The First World War took that down. Wouldn't it be wonderful to reintroduce the regatta? And we had a sample of that. Did you come to the Hansa Festival last year, where we had some racing, rowing racing on the River Ouse? Did you see that? You may have seen it on the River Ouse last year. And the Industrial Revolution coming to King's Lynn, isn't it amazing that the Industrial Revolution in King's Lynn happened here in the North End, where you had the most traditional society in Lynn, which was a fishing community doing the same thing in the same kind of craft for about 900 years. And yet it comes here, right in the middle. And it's the harbinger of that Industrial Revolution is the opening of the Alexandra Dock. We call it a dock. Princess Alexandra was on board there with her husband, the Prince of Wales, who of course became Edward VII. And that dock being put there, just over there, linked to the railway lines and the factory, Savage's factory is where I'm standing. He built his new factory in 1873 where I'm standing. So right in the middle of the North End, you had the beginnings of Lynn's first industrial revolution, which from 1870 to 1914 changed the town radically. And I'm sure you probably don't know where this is. If you go out of this door, the door you came in, and look up the street past the supermarket place, this was the Methodist chapel at the end of the road. It was built in 1883. It cost £1,000 and it could seat 400 people. Methodism and Wesleyanism was very strong in fishing communities. My father's family come from Cornwall, and my father's family, going back 3 or 4 generations, they were Methodist preachers. One went to London to preach in the East End. They were Methodists. Methodists were very strong in coastal communities, but also in mining communities. So Methodism was very strong. In fact, next door here, the primitive Methodists had a chapel. That chapel is still there if you want to see it. The chapel, you go to the end of this road and turn left, and there's a big building which is now a glazing place. Do you know what I mean? It sells conservatories.
Colin Dawson.
Colin Dawson. That was the primitive Methodist chapel built in 1862. And in 1932, the primitive Methodists joined with the Wesleyans in this building. That building, that's probably the last photograph you see here. That's the private cinema. You see the private cinema just next door. And that was demolished in about 1970. A symbol of that. Look at this one. We know the exact date of this. This is 1904. It's the choir at St Nicholas. Most of these boys are from the school, which was in Pilot Street, and their guardians or teachers, and you can see them outside the chapel. So the chapel of St Nicholas and the community were very, very interwoven. For example, if there was a funeral at the chapel, the younger kids stayed at home looking after the younger kids, even younger kids, so their parents could go to funerals and so on. The chapel was very much part of local life, but only from the 19th century. Before that, it was very much the chapel of the rich people. As you can see by walking in there and seeing all the monuments to the rich people. So that's 1904. I better speed up a bit. Look at that. The North End had its own football team. Even. So there's also 1904-1905 season. You can't see it very well, but it's on the 1903. They've won the previous year. They've won the cup. They've won the Lynn League. Look. So that's North End United. There were lots of community football teams, and these boys are all. This is the Reverend Huddle. That's him, the Huddle there, and he's the one who introduced Vaughan Williams, the composer, to the North Enders in 1905, so they could sing to him in the pubs. And so North End United, and we have a photograph somewhere in the museum. They were yellow and green shirts, and many towns had many little football teams. That's all gone. And look at this. This is an amazing picture because, in terms of fleet, that's what the Fisher fleet looked like before the Alexandra Dock. The Alexandra Dock is now there. This building is still there. That's the Tilden Smith pub, which is now two private houses. At the top of the street, turn left, you'll see a plaque on the building to Vaughan Williams. And this is the street opposite where you came in, and this is a quayside. And in 1862, a crane is recorded here to haul up the cockle baskets from the fishing smacks into the warehouses. And this area here is now the Alexandra Dock. This river is the Gaywood River from Grimston, flowing into the River Roads. So the dock encompassed, gobbled up the River Gate. And the present Fisher fleet is an artificial construction dug in 1868. So it's not an ancient fleet, it's to replace the original ancient fleet. And this is an amazing picture. I don't know what you think about art as history. When I worked for the Open University, the thing on art history, what can they tell us? Well, you've got to remember artistic license. But this is a very interesting painting, and you can see the bridge. This is Pilot Street up here. This is before the dock was built. I think it's a bit romanticised. Look at this building here. You can see the countryside in the background here, as you come into Lynn from Unstanton Road. You can see it's a community. There's one fishing smack here. It's at low tide, because there's nothing much going on. And you can see it's a community which is rather romanticised, but nevertheless, the North End used to look something like that. This chap used to paint regularly the North End. And this is 1920, so I've got a friend called Simon Masson. He's been collecting postcards for about 60 years. No, sorry Simon, about 20 years. And he loaned me 12 of his postcards for my book. And I've used them all because, as far as I know, I've never seen the pictures before. And I've certainly never seen this before. It's got, now look at the dress of the young women here. Wouldn't you agree? There's the docks in the background, 1920s. So that sort of scene has now gone, fishing boats. And onto fleets now, so that's the North End, which the North End is impacted. And that's not long ago. Kings Lynn is a town which is 900 years old, plus. So much has changed in the last 150. It's been, for hundreds of years, it's the same kind of town. A maritime economy and society, the same kind of thing. And it changed radically in the late 19th century. On fleets, I don't know if you've got any idea where this is. You've got to remember the Custom House, looking into the town. This is the Purfleet Bridge. This is the High Street. These buildings were taken down in 1865. Here's the housing of the working classes I was talking about. Look, they've got balconies, look. They've got balconies. People are living by the fleet. And here's the fleet itself. It's at low tide, as you can see. I think can't see any figures of the fleet. But if there was a very strong tide, these were rather ramshackle affairs, these balconies, and they would collapse into the water. And when they did collapse on occasions, and afterwards the report in the newspaper, luckily, very rarely did people get killed or anything. But what you did find out is that they kept animals, chickens and so on these balconies, because the newspaper reports tell you how many animals were killed, drowned, who were kept on balconies. So that's a drawing by the great Henry Baines, who I'm sure you've heard of, and is a very important artist, Victorian Lynn. And this is another artist, a Norwich artist. Now this is different. This is the man called William Taylor. This picture is looking the other way. So imagine you're standing on that bridge and looking towards the River Ouse. I like this in particular. It's in Norwich Castle Museum, not in Kings Lynn. But look, very interesting. My German laser gun seems to run out of battery. But you can see the tenements. It's at low tide. Look, people are in the water. There's a barge around at low tide. But on the left, look, you see on the left are big multis. Baker Lane car park. Taken down in the 1968. And so all that's now gone for that car park. And there's a bridge here now. And can you see there, look, the top of a wagon. There's a horse-drawn wagon going across Purfleet Bridge. So this is in my book. You had to have, of 170 odd pictures, at least half had to be coloured. So it's quite a job to make sure you have enough coloured photographs. Because the further back you go, because I'm not quite sure when coloured photography came in, but the further back you go, the more difficult it is. But look how it's built up. This is where the Lynn News used to be here. You see. Look how that's all built up in the centre of town, industry, people living, high density, gone. And it's not that long ago. A lost world. Look at you recognise that, I know. Here's the Custom House. This was a strange ship. This was at Wesley, and brought across by a chap who runs the pub across the river. It was, people were trying to restore it, but there were lots of problems which I won't go into. Here's a long boat here, and the silt was coming up. So by the late 90s or the mid-90s, there was a danger the silting would go right to the top, and the whole thing would be paved over for part of the quay. I became a councillor in 1991, I'm not now, but I said to one of my colleagues about this, and he said, "Oh, it should become part of the quay for more parking. Boats and chemists want more car parks." I thought, hold on, this is the Purfleet, which is the historic waterway in Kings Lynn. We need to save it, and luckily, how did we save it? By chance. The Millennium Project came along, and we had money. Thanks to the Millennium, it was saved, because we got a big grant from the government and put another 2 million to transform that part of the riverside. If it hadn't been for the Millennium, that would be the quay, part of the quay. And you can see what a great change has been made. Now look at this. You're looking at the same picture. This silo on the right was put up in 1935. And these were put up in the 1960s, these silos. And they were all taken down in 1992. And that's not very long ago, is it? And here's the railway trucks coming right up. The railway lines on the South Quay were taken up in 1970. So until recent times, the water side of Kings Lynn, as it had been for centuries, was a focus for industry, jobs. Even in the 1930s, on the South Quay, I used to meet people when I was a councillor, getting on a bit then. I think they're passed away now. People like Bill, who lived in Queen Street Almshouses, they were employed to jump down into the mud and dig a seat so ships could fit in and be upright and not lean over. That was their job, digging ship seats in the mud. Ship seats are important to King's Lynn history for centuries. Ship seats were made more permanent sometimes and rented by merchants with a corporation. Ship seats. And people were doing that into the 1930s. So there we are. And look at this. Can you believe that? There's a big cargo boat in the Brewery. It's called Sincerity. This photograph was taken about 1920, and it's winter time. As you can see, it's winter time, and snow, and the Clifton House, all those buildings are existing. So that just shows you how recently the Purfleet has been transformed from a working river to just something to look at. Unfortunately, we need a historic ship in there, but it's still a prospect. There's plenty of ducks. Now, any idea where this is?
Mill fleet.
Sorry?
Mill fleet.
Yep.
No?
Yeah, it is.
Oh, it is.
Yeah, on the left is the lady. This is just before the mill fleet was covered over. This is the mill fleet going out to the river. This is the Ladybridge Brewery, which was demolished finally around about 1960. So this is the mill fleet, and it was covered over by the corporation. And of course, the reason why breweries, we know breweries are on the banks of the mill fleet from the 15th century. We know that because of the records. And this was the last brewery left, the Ladybridge Brewery, and you can see right by the water, because of the water, being in the water. And that's a very unusual photograph, not that you can see. I'm sorry, it's not so clear, this one, but this is a Bain story, and it's dated, look, 1868. 1868, you can see it here, and it's got little figures in. Here are barges bringing up raw materials, and behind is the brewery. That's the Ladybridge Brewery, which was built by a man called William Eyre after 1834. The brewery was built up by a Nigerian after 1834. And you can see the bridge across the mill fleet and how barges are on the fleet. In the background is Nelson Street, and the Maltings are still there. Well, one set of Maltings which have survived, of course, are in Nelson Street, aren't they, which are now council flats. Right, I think they can, well, run by the Freebridge Lynn. So, Bain, in the Lynn Museum, there are nearly 1,000 drawings by Bain of how Lynn looked in the 1850s and 60s. Quite extraordinary. Very different place. Look at that. There's the mill fleet without the barrage. There's no barrage, is there? The barrage wasn't put up until 1988. This is the bridge across, the railway bridge. This picture is 1966. And the lorries are bringing the grain in. The grain is put into the ships. There's a ship loading grain. That looks like a German flag. This was all that remained, but this is before, just before the silos were built. In 1968, the silos were built on the South Quay. They were pulled down in 2004. But you can see another example of how the South Quay was an industrial working area. There was a chap who lived in Queen Street, long gone, I think. He used to, in the 1960s and early 70s, he took photographs of the area. So I have access to a lot of his photographs. You know, it shows you how much has changed. This is the mill fleet, built over in 1898. This is 1953, when the mill fleet was the bus station. And all this is, some of you may remember, Eastern Counties buses. There's the public library, and there's the bus shelter and the infamous toilet on the mill fleet. And here's the pub, the Lincoln. Look at the bus there. And people came into Lynn by bus. Not so many people had cars in 1953. And of course, people got off the bus here and walked into town. So all the shops between the Mill Fleet and the High Street got visited. As more people got motor cars by the late 60s, all the shopkeepers complained they weren't coming near anymore, walking through the town, they were going straight to the town centre. And a lot of shops in Tower Street and other places complained they were losing custom. But then, in 1971, as you know, the bus station was closed and moved to the present site, which was the cattle market. And on the cattle market, they opened a new bus station, and at the same time built Sainsbury's. You know, so the Lynn cattle market, which had been there a long time, became a shopping centre and bus station, and this was left really. Now very quiet. And going on to pubs, final section, I'm doing you a very, still got a few minutes. This is the Eagle. Some of you I'm sure have seen this. This is the Eagle in Norfolk Street. If you go and see it now, you'd be quite amazed. It was built in 1953, the present building, 1950s. Do you see the Eagle on the top? Do you see the Eagle? It was hit by a German bomb in 1942. We don't know how many casualties they were, but at least around about 50 people, some servicemen were playing billiards in the basement. So we know a lot of servicemen, Americans and British. We're not quite, no one knows how many people were killed that night. But it was quite early in the morning. My mum, who passed away recently, but she saw the German planes coming over. Sometimes German planes came over Lynn. They came over Lynn on the way to the Midlands, Birmingham and Coventry, and came back over Lynn. And sometimes they had the odd bomb for some reason. They lobbed it on Lynn. Lynn was never a big target, unlike Yarmouth and Norwich. And some people saw the German plane drop the bombs. And sometimes over Lynn, amazingly, in the Second World War, aeroplanes in the Midlands, they got lost from the pack. And on one occasion, an old North Ender, a few years ago, I had coffee with him, and he said he was a little kid on the walks from school, the walks just overhead, and a plane hit. It was damaged. It wasn't very high. And here was all these school kids on the walks, and this German Messerschmitt trying to get over the North Sea, get back to Germany. And of course the teachers said, Pedro, what's going to happen here? But this guy, he was so close, he said, and he simply waved to the kids. Whether he got back to Germany, who knows? But Lynn was involved in that war in that sense. But of course Lynn was very much involved because pubs like this were lodging houses as well. And King's Lynn in 1942 had 2,000 foreign soldiers, Americans, Canadians, Czechs living in Lynn. 2,000 Lynn lads were away. So 2,000 Linnets left, if you like, to go into the army, the navy, and so on. And 2,000 other people came in. And that's a pub. You probably don't know where that is.
Grove now.
Yeah, okay, yes. That's now the corner of, this is Norfolk Street, and this is Broad Street. And I once showed this slide a long while ago, and there's a chap in the audience who claimed that was his bike. I don't know if that's true. Yeah. And this was let out for weddings. And quite interestingly, in the 19th century, the Jewish community in Lynn was quite large up until about 1850, and they used to use this for their parties and wedding receptions. The Jewish community in King's Lynn, which today is quite very small, and they go to the Cambridge Synagogue. But up until the 1850s, Lynn had a substantial Jewish community, and that was demolished, and sadly, around about 1960, and their new buildings now, the buildings you see, the 1960s unremarkable horizontal buildings. Here's the town hall, you recognise that okay, but this is called the Lynn Tavern, a famous pub in King's Lynn history, and it was demolished for an extension of the town hall in 1903-4. And this pub was famous for sailors, and in the windows they used to have notices. It was called the Early Pearl, because sailors, if the tide was up early in the morning, the sailors had to come out, and they had to unhinge the boats from big chains, because the whole River Road was full of ships. It was like a car park, with ships in their parking lot. And to get the ships unhooked and ready for the sea was a huge, heavy job in the morning. And they used to go there halfway through that for their breakfast and drink this Early Pearl, which was warm beer with a sort of wormwood flavour. And pubs which sold the Early Pearl had a notice in the window, Early Pearl, to give you strength and warmth for your hard job, especially in the winter, the frosty months. And the whole river is full of sailors and ships. And the pub serviced them. We're talking about only up to 120 years ago. And all that's gone. That pub was demolished. And this is the Valiant Sailor in Nelson Street. And this is now lived in by Dr. Elizabeth Harrison. Look at this lovely sign, although you can't see it very well, by Henry Baines. This is Nelson Street, look. The lovely sign, the Valiant Sailor, and that closed in, it was right at the top of the lane, people coming in, and that closed in 1925. The first reference to the Valiant Sailor is 1725, and it closed in 1925. It was one of the bag pubs. It was serviced by the Bags Brewery in King Street. And so one of the members of the Bag family lived in this house in Nelson Street with the medieval door. That's a bag house. And the people who live there now asked me about 2 or 3 years ago to do a hit, so I wrote a history of the house in terms of the bag, when the bags were there. The pub has gone. Nelson Street had 6 pubs. It wasn't the most successful pub in Nelson Street. Another pub was further down, but called the Wellington, where Tony Williams lives on the corner, called Ladybridge House. There was a pub there, which is now his garden, and that was the most successful pub, because we know that all the landlords made huge amounts of money and bought antiques and so on. But this, in 1901, there was a chap called Howard, he was a often retired sailors. He was living there with his 2 young daughters. They're the only people recorded, so it's not even got any lodgers. Most pubs by the waterside have lodgers, and some of the pubs by the waterside, if you go to the attic, you'll see the graffiti made by sailors. When they were sleeping up there, waiting for the next ship, they doodled and they drew their ships. And some of them in attics by the waterside have graffiti by sailors and ships. And this is where I live. That's Clifton House. This is where I live here. It's called, and you can see, it's a pub. It's got you can't read it, but there it is. Now, you see, that's the sign. That's the pub sign. The 3 Crowns. And it was closed in 1912. And we know where, we invited some people around who were living there in the 1950s, and it hadn't been changed very much, as it was by Simmons in 1980, to show us how the old bar was laid out and so on. And we're going to get a plaque. I've told Alison that we need a plaque saying, this is the 3 Crowns. So we're trying to get that sorted. And but opposite here was another pub here. That's the Ship. The Ship was another pub. Many of these places, as the sailors diminished in number, many of these places, the police were very interested in closing a number of these pubs. I should say the Liberal magistrates were, and the police were invited by the magistrates to visit pubs on a Friday or Saturday night and then report back. And if they reported back, 8 o'clock on a Saturday, there was only 1 person in the bar. And that was used as evidence that it was unneeded. And there was a compensation scheme under the 1904 Act by government, Liberal governments didn't want to close pubs. There was a scheme under the 1904 Act. If you closed the pub, the owners would get compensation. So many of these pubs in the Riverside streets were closed by order of the licensing authorities, but they got compensation from a government fund. And that's what happened to the Ship. And there was only 1 old boy there. It closed in 1911 and that 1914. So 8 pubs in Queen Street. Not 1 today, sadly. And this is now, you might go here for lunch. Prezos on the Tuesday Marketplace, and that's the old building. And the old building, it's been there for centuries. Well, that one was rebuilt in 1800. Before that, there was a water pack, and that was rebuilt in 1952 and closed in 2009 to become Prezos. But it was a pub for waterside workers. And this is another pub. This building, that building there, was an eating house, a cheap cafe. This building is another pub, which is completely changed. The front has been completely knocked out and changed. It's now an estate agent with a peaked window. I think you may know where I mean. And that's called the Exchange pub. And that did take lodgers, but people locally complained because of music on Saturday nights. Most pubs had a music room, you needed a license. If you had a piano and a music room, you needed a license. So on Saturday night, when you didn't have to go to work on Sunday, you went on later and had a good booze up and sing up, and neighbours began to complain at some places. Most of the North End pubs have a music license. And look at this one. This is, John, this is where we might go tomorrow, I think. This is Ferry Lane. And this balcony was rebuilt in 1949 for £1,000. It says, you can't read it, it says the Ferry House. But it's winter time, and it's the Cambridge boat crew at Lynn. So these guys have rowed down river from Cambridge on one of their practice runs, so they can beat Oxford in the next race, build their muscles up. So this is the Cambridge crew at Lynn, and the date is around about 1900, and of course these are the ferry steps, hence the ferry boat, and the pub became became the headquarters in the 1930s of the Ouse Amateur Sailing Club, which is now called the Ferry Lane Social Club. But the Ouse Amateur Sailing Club was formed in 1881 and this became their HQ when it was sold by Mr. Tilson, who was the landlord and owner. And this is another pub. This has a remarkable connection to Troujard. This is now the solicitors, MCP, you may use them. I think they're the only solicitors in the centre of Lynn who do criminal law. Most solicitors don't do crime anymore because legal aid stopped, there's no money in it. They all gave up. But they still do criminal law. My granddaughter recently went there for a week's work experience, was taken to court. You know, she wants to be a solicitor. So they took her into the courthouse, and that's about the only place you can get a work placement to do with criminal law. And it was a pub for a long time. And this pub, you know, you can tell this is medieval, these are 13th century. But this pub was closed around about 1912, it had lodgers, and Mr. Hines and his wife ran it around 1900. And it was in Troujard, we discovered invoices in the pub next door when we were restoring the next door. We discovered invoices saying how they'd got smoked fish from the next door here at Troujard. It's a smokehouse. Well, the smokehouse is still in the yard, as you know. That they bought smoked fish from Troujard. That's how we found a link here. And it was restored in the 1970s by the King's Lynn Preservation Trust. It was going to become the King's Lynn Heritage Centre, but unfortunately it never did. So that's another pub in King Street which was closed because of the numbers of people attending were diminishing, mainly due to the takeover of steamships. And there you are. That just shows you how you can take topics and investigate them, and how much Lynn changed through industrialisation, how much has changed in the last 150 years. That doesn't mean to say you can't walk through Lynn and connect with the distant past, the maritime past, because you can. Because you've got the streets and merchant houses and custom houses, you can. But in terms of the character of the town and the identity of the town, it changed greatly from the 1870s up to 1914. Then there was a bit of a lull, and then from 1962 to today has changed radically again. So this sense of, you know, what's been lost, it doesn't mean to say what's been lost is all bad. This idea of lost is for better or worse. That's, you know, the approach is, it's not good or bad, we're just sort of recording that it's for better, or some of us might think it's for the worse, Others might think, you know, it's for the better. And some guy I know, he says, oh, it's good all those slums went, Paul. I said, but they could have done up a lot of these slums. But you know, so you're going to have different views of the past. So it's for better or worse. It's not. I'm not saying it's all a bad thing. I'm simply pointing out that our country, a town like Lynn, which 900 years old, has changed. It was the same sort of town for centuries, and in the last 150 years has changed a great deal. And I hope that gives you some flavour of the kind of thing you can look at to show this, how a maritime society became a modern industrial society. And so there you are. And we're still looking gently for any donations you might like to give. There's a box outside when you do leave. But we're asking you to stay in your seats until you're sort of asked to leave. But any donation will be gratefully received. But thank you once again for coming and supporting us. Thank you very much indeed.